So the first question that we've got is from Sorrel, who asked about incorporating tree canopy data.
Yes. Trees have been a major problem. It's getting data that we can use, which hits the sweet spot of being open government licensable, so we can put it on the site and we can use it, but also isn't going to cost us an arm and a leg. And we haven't, well, until very recently, we haven't been able to do that. So we did look initially at using the Blue Sky data, which is probably the best data that there is. Unfortunately, it's commercial data, and I have real issues incorporating commercial data into this mapping, partly because of the cost, partly because of licensing, but also partly because of our philosophy of change detection. If it's going, imagine the data I need needs to cover England, or at least the important bits of it that we're looking at the time. That's not cheap. It costs tens of thousands of pounds to purchase this data. And of course, once you've done it once and you want to do change detection, you'll have to update. That means you have to spend it all over again, plus inflation. So we weren't able to find any tree data we could use for version 1 in literally the last few weeks. Two sources of data have been published, one by Friends of the Earth and one by Forest Research tree canopy data, or urban tree canopy data in particular, and we haven't had a chance to have a look at them yet. I still have issues. They are on different geographies, so one of them's on wards, one of them's on LSOAs. They will have strengths and weaknesses, and of course it's canopy, and the problem with canopy is if you have an LSOA, two LSOAs side by side, one has a wood in it, one doesn't, the one with the wood in it will have a higher tree canopy than the one which doesn't, simply because it's got a wood in it. But if you're interested in trees in more general environment, then that's a distortion that we'd have to take out. So there's a lot to do with trees that we haven't been able to do. I'm hoping we can start to do something with trees, particularly if we start to look at air quality, where trees are quite important in the urban environment. But I have a suspicion the data won't be quite as good as we're going to need. But trees are a problem. They're missing completely. We've got woods, but you ain't got trees, not yet.
In Wales, obviously we've got the same or similar woodland data sets to England, but as John Briggs could tell us, we had to let a contract where we had people counting individual tree canopy extents on aerial photographs. So we managed to do that for all our urban areas. But it's getting increasingly difficult, and we're looking at how we can use Earth observations to do that in future. So Sorrel, I don't know if that has answered or started to answer your question. Actually, looking, and it looks like Sorrel has oh, there we go. Big thumbs up from Sorrel. I'll move on to the next question, which was asked by Liz Mills, and Liz was asking about its use in neighbourhood planning. Liz, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question directly?
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I was just, I thought this looked like a really good resource for neighbourhood planning. I've been involved in the neighbourhood plan for where I live, which is a village outside Bath at the moment. And there was a huge difficulty in getting data out of the local authority, especially on the green spaces, and it ended up with a very contentious part of the local plan, our neighbourhood plan. And so I'm wondering if people have spotted this opportunity and are already using it.
It's a good question. There's certainly interest. We have, one of our stakeholder groups is neighbourhood planning. It's not just sort of local authorities. So I know that some are interested, some are aware. I suspect overall awareness at the moment is still quite low at that level. And the concern I have is, as I mentioned, the closer to the ground you get, the more you're going to start to see errors in the data. And there is a whole series of reasons why there are errors in the data, and particularly in rural areas where some of the assumptions we've had to make don't necessarily stack up. They're better for urban, there's a skewing there. So at the neighbourhood level, it does require some ground truthing, but fundamentally, of course, it's unfriendly data, it's GIS data. You've got to have the requisite hardware, you've got to have the requisite software. A lot of that it isn't free necessarily, and then you've got to be able to manipulate the data as well. So they're going to need help. Most neighbourhood planning groups would need help to access, understand the data, and then to ground truth it as well before they can turn it into a product which is really robust in terms of the neighbourhood plan itself. But certainly it gets you. I tend to say this data set, this database, gets you part of the way. It might get you 50%, 60%, or 70% of the way, but there's always some work to do, that 30% or plus, which has to be input to turn it into that locally robust product. This works well at a national to local authority level, but you know, getting down local, then issues start to emerge. So I hope people do find it. It's designed to help people in these circumstances, but with caveats.
That's great, thanks.
About how this relates to natural beauty mapping. Alwyn, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question to Martin?
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, don't think video is working, but yeah, just a question really, because it's really interesting, Martin. We are undertaking a similar project to Natural England, All England Natural Beauty Mapping in Wales, and we're looking at nature recovery, climate change and wellbeing as well, which you sort of touched on at the end there after I asked the question. But one of the things we're sort of thinking about at the moment is how to incorporate urban areas and green infrastructure into that. You know, obviously they've got, you know, quite different scales of data and mapping and so forth. And just wondering how, if you could sort of explain a little bit how that worked in Natural England.
Yes, how did it work at Natural England? Did it work at Natural England? I suppose it did to a bit. Yeah. I think the traffic was from the GI mapping into the natural beauty stuff. Some of the data that they used came out of the GI mapping. Ironically, they used some of the data that we've now taken down, which is quite interesting. They obviously have quite a specific purpose, which is different to this, but there is a relationship. I don't think it's particularly well articulated yet, but the main issue, of course, is that it does operate at a different scale and with a different sort of depiction geography, which makes the two structurally great against each other a little bit. But I suppose it's one of the areas. There are a whole series of areas where we need to start looking at how these things work together, and we are starting to do that as they come online. So things like local nature recovery strategies, things like the national habitat data work that's on the way. Those relationships are being mapped out, but several things are happening at the same time, so it's not quite necessarily as joined up as it could be.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, I think it's probably something you want to have further conversations about. I think with yourselves, you know, and the Natural Beauty Project people as well, Gary as well. So thanks for that.
And Lucy Taylor had a question about how you mapped allotments and social gardens and community gardens. Lucy, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, hi Martin. Yeah, really interesting. We at Social Farms and Gardens, we were tasked with mapping all the community gardens and allotments across Wales, and undertaking. We haven't been able to sort of get it converted to GIS sort of type data yet. Excuse my ignorance. But yeah, I was just interested how you went about doing it. Was it information shared by local authorities? Yeah, just how you went about doing it.
Yeah, hang on a sec. Just writing something down. Okay, so allotments. We are dependent on the OS green space data for allotments. So if it's in there, then we've reflected it. It's in the mapping. We don't do anything. We haven't done anything yet, although it's on the way with allotments. But we are also identifying allotments or food growing or what look like food growing areas through the urban habitat mapping as well, which is an Earth observation project in itself. Just challenging, and of course, not all allotments. It's not all about food. There are various different things in allotments. So we're peering in to the allotment to see how much of it is actually cultivated, how much of it is something else, which reflects back on the sort of the naturalness side of things. So we've got some information about allotments, particularly urban food growing opportunity. And we're interested doing some work at the moment on how we can turn various data sets into an understanding of food production in the urban environment in terms of where, but also yield. And the numbers are quite interesting. But anyway, that's for the future. As for community gardens, we have this question also with things like community orchards. We can't identify them. I don't know of a data set that would cover England or even just urban England that would give us that information, or whether or not it's consistently collated across even local authority to local authority. And that's a major issue for us, because of course, first of all, collating data from multitudes of organizations, include just local authorities, 350 odd or something like that across England. It's a hell of a challenge. We face that challenge with the right of way data, where you put more and more effort into getting less and less data, and eventually at the end you have to draw a line in the sand and say, that's it, we've got what we're going to get. We're just going to have to live with the fact that we've got gaps on the map, and there are 47 gaps in the right of way data, largely because they're either urban areas with few rights of way, so the data might be it's just a sort of raster image. We need vector data. We can't use raster, or it's literally sat in a dusty office on a piece of paper and was scrawled in pen, which we can't digitize. So there are major issues around data collation, and that affects things like community gardens and community orchards, but it also includes things like village greens. We don't have village greens in the data. The data set for village greens in England dates from about 1994, therefore predates 1994. It's like looking at a previous age. We knew it was inaccurate then. It's much more inaccurate now, and it's only point data anyway, so you don't actually know. You just have a point on the map, somewhere within the vicinity there may or may not be a village green. So they're all missing, and to rectify that, we'd have to go to each of the village green registration authorities, local authorities, and say, give us your data. It's a big job. It's a big task. We haven't tried it yet. We are thinking about whether or not it is even technically feasible to ask local authorities to provide us with their open space data so that we can collate it. But I don't underestimate the size or difficulty of that task either. So there are various assets out there, which at the scale we're doing in England, it's very difficult, probably impossible really, to get comprehensive data. It's one of the things that you can possibly add in at more local scale. So I would envisage an authority downloading the national data, cutting out their bit of it, and then importing the data that they have locally, even some of the data that we won't have because it's not open, in order again to turn it into the product which is more comprehensive in terms of coverage of different types of assets. But there are limits. One of the issues that I've had is, how far do you go as a national mapping project before you say this isn't something we can do nationally? It has to be done locally or not at all. And I think some of these things are in that bag, certainly at the moment.
Yeah, that's useful. Yeah, we did actually do orchards and all types of food growing spaces across Wales, which was it was a massive undertaking. And it is like point data, so it would be good to be able to sort of get it sort of joined up with some sort of GIS function that's public accessible, but it's a bit tricky, like you said.
Yeah. Point data is interesting stuff. We don't like to use it. We only use it if we absolutely have to. And one of the I think the only point at the moment, some of the Sport England data we've used, because that's point data, but there's a lot attached to the point, a lot of detailed information. The other point data is actually beaches, designated bathing waters, as it were, which we'd love to be able to show the extents of, but all you actually have is a point. So you don't know, is that a point which is the size of a thumbnail, or is it a point where a beach which is 5 miles long? You can't tell. So point data is interesting stuff, but it's not my it's not my favorite type of data. I avoid it if I can.
Yeah, I'm sure. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for asking that question. Do keep in touch with me, because this is something that we need to address in Wales as well. To get those boundary data for allotments. So this one is going to run and run. There was another question that Liz raised, which is, are the slides from this presentation going to be available? Martin, I know that there are other presentations which are on YouTube and which are accessible through the website. So I'm wondering if you could email me links to pertinent presentations and to the data set itself,
Yeah.
if you're allowed to do that, and then I'll
Yeah.
send them out with the announcement that the video from this
Yeah,
meeting
yeah,
has been
okay.
posted.
I can provide the slides that I would have shown. I showed you the site instead of the slides, so I can send that. But there is, of course, I'll send the link to where you can actually get the data. But there's also a highlighted. There is the deep dive, which is the full hour and a half detailed layer by layer description of most of the content, even with an hour and a half. I couldn't quite get there, so I'll send that link as well.
Thank you very much, and I'll then circulate that to the whole of the Wales Green Infrastructure Forum. Alex from Keep Wales Tidy has got a question. Alex.
Yeah, hi Pete. Hi, thanks Martin. Very interesting work, and I'm sure very detailed. Just a follow up to you, Lucy, and Pete. We also sort of work with local places for nature packages here in Wales, and sort of installation of a lot of community gardens and food growing spaces and small orchards and that kind of thing. But they also now exist as sort of point data, just because it's easier to manage, at least operationally. But these areas exist, you probably know, like sometimes on school greens, so like subsets of other green spaces. So it's very interesting, just to kind of think about in the future, kind of trying to map that as a distinct polygon or area, but they differ quite widely in terms of area. But like Pete said, kind of a challenge to kind of incorporate that, and along with like Lucy's information about food growing spaces.
Thanks, Alex.
Time now, so I've got a question for Martin, and that is, you mentioned tantalizingly that you're going to be using Earth observation more often. This is something that we're interested in for updating a canopy cover data set.
Yeah.
Earth observation for for land cover, land use. Can you tell us more about the data sources?
Yeah.
So you in league with Elon Musk?
No, not quite. Interestingly, yeah, interesting. The main context for this at the moment, we do use Earth obs data, satellite data, in various different little bits of the mapping. Some of the stuff is on the way, at least, but that's not out yet. But for the urban habitat and naturalist mapping, that is an Earth observation based approach. And the first thing we did was to, I guess, experiment, ask the question really, what data is best to use. And we did undertake an experiment comparing the outputs we got from satellite data, which was, I think it was Worldview 2 data, which of course is commercial data. Going back to what I said about commercial data, can be difficult. But we wanted to know, okay, if we use that, what do we get versus use of APGB, which is Aerial Photography Great Britain, which is provided to government. It's not free; they have to pay for it, but it's free to me as a user in government, as it were. So I have, do I pay for it? Do I use something which is free? Well, that depends. If I'm going to have to pay, I'm going to need something which is significantly better than I can get if we basically digitize aerial photography and add in various other data sets. And what we found was that we were getting better from the aerial imagery than we were from the satellite data. Nonetheless, we of course use LiDAR data, which is satellite data, and that provides us with essential information which we combine with the aerial imagery and various other bits and pieces as well to create the urban habitat map. So Earth obs, it has its limitations. So even with the urban habitat mapping, we go down to a 5 square meter pixel. And I don't mean 5 meters squared, I mean 5 square meters. So it's pretty detailed. The problem is, even with aerial imagery, differentiating between things isn't very easy to do. Some things are easier than others. So one of the grasslands is a classic. We want to know in the urban environment, okay, what's the totality of grassland? But can we differentiate those grasslands which at the moment are being mown to death, which are either going to stay low in terms of value, or potentially that is nature recovery real estate for the future, versus those grasslands which have some sort of interest at the moment. Of course, you can't differentiate between different grassland types in terms of traditional habitat systems, but we'd hope to be able to separate those two out. In fact, the margins for error, you can sort of do it, but there's a huge margin for error. So it gets really difficult. So it's not the answer to all the questions. It's not ideal, but compared to the costs of having to go out and do an actual survey of the whole of urban England, it's the only sort of it's the only party in town. It's the only affordable party in town, at least.
Clock, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for for giving us the opportunity to grill you about the All England data set. It, as you said, it's a gargantuan task, a Herculean endeavor, and it's ongoing. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. I know that you and I are going to continue to have conversations about this, but just yes, thank you.
Because we
thank
do
you
have
once
the
again
issue.
for your time.
We've got a boundary. We need to talk about that at some time.
Indeed, we do.
Good.
So once again, thank you so much indeed, Martin. And
No problem.
I'll say goodbye now to you and to everyone else, and hope to see everybody at our next webinar. Bye for now.
Bye for now. Cheers.